Thank you for tuning in. You are watching ProPix TV. I'm James Kuzno, coming to you from the studios in Vancouver, British Columbia. Today we're going to take a look at the shadow of assimilation, and that was Canada's Indian residential schools. The history of the Canadian Indian residential schools spans over a 160-year period, during which upwards of over 150,000 First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children passed through their doors. With the exception of Prince Edward Island, Newfoundland, and New Brunswick, every province and territory in Canada was home to these federally funded, church-run institutions. The operation of these schools was a key tool in a broader strategy of aggressive assimilation and the colonization of Indigenous peoples and their territories in Canada. The policy pursued by the Canadian government aimed to divest itself of legal and financial obligations to the Indigenous people and to gain control over their land and resources. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada articulated this motive very clearly, stating that if every Indigenous person were absorbed into the body politic, there would be no reserves, no treaties, and no Indigenous rights. The sheer scale and longevity of these residential school system underscores a deeply entrenched and enduring government policy aimed at the systemic erasure of the Indigenous culture and identity. The explicit link between this policy and the desire to eliminate treaty obligations and gain control over Indigenous lands reveals a pragmatic, albeit profoundly unethical, motivation that extended beyond the stated cultural or religious objectives. The multitude of schools operating for such an extensive period signifies a widespread and meticulously planned effort to achieve these goals. Key figures of the time openly expressed the dehumanizing intent behind this system. Nicholas Flood Davin, in his 1879 report on industrial schools for Indians and half-breeds, recommended that if anything is to be done with the Indian, we must catch him very young. The children must be kept constantly within the circle of civilized conditions. Similarly, Duncan Campbell Scott, the Deputy Superintendent of Indian Affairs in 1920, declared the objective was to continue until there was not a single Indigenous person in Canada who had not been absorbed into the body politic, effectively ending the Indian question and the need for an Indian Department. These statements reveal the explicit and deeply prejudiced ideology that underpinned this residential school system. Indigenous identity was viewed as an inherent problem, an obstacle to Canada's development, and the language used reflects a pervasive belief in the superiority of Euro-Canadian culture and a desire for the complete disappearance of Indigenous distinctiveness. The strategy of targeting children from a young age, as Davin suggested, highlights a calculated approach to dismantle Indigenous cultures at their most vulnerable point. Scott's pronouncements further solidified the ultimate goal, the total assimilation and erasure of the Indigenous peoples as distinct entities within Canadian society. While the formal federal residential school system began around 1883, its origins can be traced back much earlier into what were called mission schools. As early as the mid-1600s, churches had established schools specifically for Indigenous children. The Anglican Church established a residential school in Brantford, Ontario in the 1830s, predating Confederation in 1867. The Mohawk Institute, which operated in 1831 and began accepting boarders in 1834, stands as the oldest continuously operated residential school in Canada. Initially, these mission schools were primarily located in eastern Canada, but as missionary and colonial efforts expanded west of the Great Lakes, so did the schools. Various Christian denominations, including Anglican, Catholic, Methodist, Presbyterian, and United Churches, played a significant role in establishing and operating these early educational institutions. This extended pre-Confederation history indicates that the concept of residential schooling for Indigenous children was not a sudden development, but rather an evolving strategy deeply rooted in colonial and missionary endeavors. The consistent and long-term involvement of churches from the earliest stages highlights a significant and enduring partnership in this assimilation project. The official party of federal funding for residential schools was adopted in the 1880s. A key influence on this policy was the 1879 Davin Report, which recommended that Canada follow the example of the United States in implementing a system of aggressive civilization through industrial schools. The Indian Act of 1876 and its subsequent amendments provided the legal framework for the residential school system. The 1884 amendments specifically provided for the creation of these schools, while a crucial 1920 amendment made attendance compulsory for treaty status. Indigenous children between the ages of 7 and 15, later extended to 7 and 16, Initially, the residential school system focused on industrial labor schools and farm schools. By 1931, the system reached its peak with 80 schools in operation across the country. The Indian Act at the time served as the fundamental legal instrument that authorized and enabled the establishment and enforcement of the residential school system, demonstrating the Canadian government's active and central role in this policy. The move to compulsory attendance in 1920 signifies an intensification of the assimilation policy, reflecting a growing determination to achieve its objectives. The residential school system had both explicit and implicit goals. The explicit intent was to separate Indigenous children from their families and cultures, aiming to, as they called at the time, civilize and Christianize them. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada concluded that these schools were a systemic, government-sponsored attempt to destroy Aboriginal cultures and languages and to assimilate Aboriginal peoples so that they could no longer exist as distinct peoples. A conclusion that characterized the system as a cultural genocide. This aligns with the government's underlying motivations to divest itself of obligations and gain control over Indigenous lands and resources. The term cultural genocide, as determined by the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, underscores the profound and devastating impact the residential school system was intended to have on Indigenous cultures. The connection between this cultural destruction and the acquisition of Indigenous lands and resources reveals a strategic and ultimately self-serving motive that lays at the heart of this government policy. The systemic nature of the attempt to eliminate Indigenous cultures highlights a deliberate and sustained effort to achieve complete assimilation. The experiences of Indigenous children being taken from their families and communities were marked by trauma and loss. This forced separation often occurred against the will of both the children and the parents. In some instances, children were forcibly removed from their homes. The schools were often located far from the children's home communities, sometimes hundreds or even thousands of kilometers away. This deliberate geographical separation was a key tactic in the broader strategy of assimilation, aiming to sever the vital connections between the children and their families, communities, and cultural heritage. The act of forcibly removing children, often accompanied by distress and resistance from both the children and their parents, caused profound, immediate, and long-lasting trauma, fundamentally disrupting family structures and the transmission of Indigenous cultures across generations. Daily life inside the residential schools was characterized by strict, regimented schedules and a severe lack of personal freedom. A bell often indicated every aspect of a student's day. Living conditions typically were poor, marked by overcrowding, chronic underfunding, and substandard buildings. Sanitation was often inadequate, and access to sufficient food and proper health care was severely lacking. The suppression of Indigenous languages, traditions, and cultural practices was systemic and pervasive. Children were often severely punished for speaking their native languages. Methods of dehumanization included cutting their hair, forcing them to wear uniforms, and sometimes assigning them numbers instead of using their names. Even siblings were often kept separate, further weakening family ties. This regimented and oppressive environment was intentionally designed to dismantle the children's sense of individuality and cultural identity. The harsh conditions and the systemic eradication of Indigenous culture created an atmosphere of hardship, fear, and profound loss, fundamentally undermining the physical, emotional, and spiritual well-being of the children. The separation of siblings not only caused immediate distress, but also eroded the crucial support systems that family bonds provide. The curriculum in the residential school programs prioritized manual labor and religious instruction over comprehensive academic education. Students often received education only up to the lower grades. Girls were typically trained for domestic service, learning skills such as laundry, sewing, cooking, and cleaning, while the boys were taught trades like carpentry, tinsmithing, and farming. A significant portion of the day was dedicated to unpaid labor, which was essential for the operation and upkeep of the underfunded schools. As its foundation, the educational program had a core Christianizing mandate, with Christian readers and workbooks serving as primary textbooks. This curriculum was intentionally designed to prepare Indigenous children for lives of manual labor in service roles, effectively limiting their opportunities for advancement and perpetuating societal beliefs of Indigenous inferiority. The strong emphasis on religious instruction aimed to supplant Indigenous spiritual beliefs with Christianity, further contributing to cultural assimilation. The exploitative use of unpaid labor not only sustained the schools, but also significantly detracted from the time available for academic learning. Abuse and neglect were widespread within the residential school system. Children endured various forms of abuse, including physical beatings, strappings, being shackled, having needles inserted into their tongues, and even electric shocks. Emotional and psychological abuse was constant, and sexual abuse was also tragically common. These horrific conditions contributed to shockingly high rates of illness and deaths among the students due to neglect, abuse, lack of food, and the spread of diseases, particularly tuberculosis. Dr. P.H. Bryce, a government medical inspector, reported on the alarmingly high mortality rates in these schools. Estimates of the total number of deaths vary widely, ranging from 3,200 to as high as 30,000 children. The pervasive abuse and neglect within these institutions, coupled with the horrifying death toll, reveal a systemic failure in the duty of care owed to these children. The fact that these abuses went largely unacknowledged and unpunished for many years only served to deepen the trauma experienced by survivors and their communities. Over time, a growing awareness of the profound harms caused by the residential school system began to emerge. Even during the operation of the schools, criticisms were voiced regarding their effectiveness and the conditions within them. However, it was not until much later that the broader public began to understand the true extent of the damage. The 1996 Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples was a landmark moment, drawing significant attention to the lasting harm inflicted by these institutions. Increasingly, survivors demonstrated immense courage by coming forward to share their deeply personal and traumatic stories, demanding recognition and action. A pivotal moment in this process was the public disclosure in 1990 by Phil Fontaine, then National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, about physical and sexual abuse he experienced at a residential school. The brave act paved the way for countless other survivors to share their own experiences. In 2006, the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement was reached, representing a significant step towards acknowledging the harm. The agreements included provisions for a common experience payment to all eligible former students, an independent assessment process for claims of serious abuse, and the establishment of a commemoration fund. However, it is important to note that the Métis survivors were initially excluded from this settlement. The gradual growth of awareness and the eventual settlement agreement marked important milestones in the long journey towards acknowledging the devastating legacy of the residential school system. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was established in 2008 as a crucial component of the IRSSA. Its mandate was to inform all Canadians about what transpired in the residential schools by bearing witness to and documenting the truths of survivors, their families, and their communities. Over its 6-year mandate, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission heard from more than 6,500 witnesses and amassed a collection of approximately 5 million documents from government and church archives. A central finding of the TRC was the characterization of the residential school system as a cultural genocide. In recognition of the profound impact of this history, the residential school system was designated a National Historic Event in 2019, and September 30th was established as the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. The TRC provided an essential national platform for survivors to share their experiences, ensuring the truth about residential schools was brought to light and formally acknowledged. The designation of the system as cultural genocide by the TRC carries immense weight, condemning the devastating impact of these policies. The establishment of a National Day of Remembrance further underscores the importance of this history in the Canadian narrative. Truth and Reconciliation Commission issued 94 calls to action, representing recommendations directed at all levels of government and Canadian society to advance the process of reconciliation. These calls span a wide range of areas, including child welfare, education, language and culture, health, justice, and reconciliation itself. Various organizations and government bodies are currently tracking the progress of these calls, and implementation has been very uneven, with some advancements but also significant challenges and delays. Reports indicate that progress has been slow, and there is a recognized need for more substantial systemic changes to address the deep-rooted issues stemming from the legacy of the residential schools. The 94 calls to action represent a comprehensive roadmap for reconciliation, yet their effective implementation requires sustained and concerted effort from all sectors of Canadian society. The varying levels of progress highlight the complexities and the ongoing need for commitment to achieve meaningful and lasting change. The trauma inflicted by residential school system has had a profound and long-lasting effect, extending beyond the individuals who directly attended schools to their families and communities through intergenerational trauma. This trauma manifests itself in numerous ways, including mental health challenges such as depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, and PTSD, as well as issues with addiction, family violence, and loss of traditional parenting skills. It has also led to a cultural disconnect, lower levels of educational and social attainment, and increased rates of poverty within the Indigenous communities. The 60s scoop, during which the Indigenous children were disproportionately removed from their families and placed in foster care, is considered by many to be a continuation of these harmful policies. The enduring legacy of intergenerational trauma underscores the profound and far-reaching damage caused by residential school systems, impacting not only survivors but also subsequent generations. Understanding this complex web of consequences is crucial for developing effective and culturally sensitive approaches to healing and reconciliation. These discoveries of unmarked graves at former residential school sites, beginning at the Kamloops School, of what were believed to be 215 graves here in British Columbia. That happened in 2021 and had a profound impact. These discoveries have resonated deeply with survivors and have had a significant emotional impact on Canadian society as a whole. They have brought a renewed and urgent focus to this tragic loss of life that occurred within these institutions and have amplified the calls for truth, justice, and reconciliation. Ongoing efforts are underway to identify and properly commemorate these graves, acknowledging the children who died while attending residential schools. These discoveries serve as a stark and irrefutable reminder of the devastating human cost of the assimilationist policies enacted by the Government of Canada and the churches that operated the residential schools. Now, efforts towards reconciliation have included formal apologies from both the Canadian government and various churches involved in the operation of the schools. In 2022, Pope Francis also issued an apology for the role of the Catholic Church in the residential school system. Legislative efforts have been undertaken, such as the Act respecting First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children, youth, and families, and the Indigenous Languages Act. The National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation continues its vital work in preserving the history and legacy of the residential schools and promoting reconciliation. Despite these efforts, the pace and depth of reconciliation have faced criticism, with many advocating for more substantial and meaningful action. While these steps are important, true reconciliation requires sustained commitment to addressing the systemic inequalities and injustices that continue to affect Indigenous peoples in Canada. The legacy of residential schools remains profoundly relevant in Canadian society today. The impacts of this system continue to manifest in various aspects of life for Indigenous communities, including overrepresentation in child welfare and justice system programs, persistent health disparities, and economic challenges, including poverty, the ongoing loss of Indigenous languages, and the erosion of cultural practices. There is a continuing and critical need for education and awareness among non-Indigenous Canadians to foster a deeper understanding of this history and its ongoing consequences. The enduring legacy of residential schools is not merely a chapter in Canada's past. Its effects are deeply woven in the present-day social, economic, and cultural landscape. Addressing these ongoing consequences necessitates a fundamental transformation in the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in Canada, moving towards a future built on respect, understanding, and justice. Now, the story of the history of Canada's Indian residential schools is a stark reminder of the dark chapter in the nation's past. The systemic removal of Indigenous children from their families, the suppression of their cultures and languages, and the widespread abuse they endured have left an indelible mark on Indigenous peoples across Canada. The journey towards reconciliation requires a full and honest acknowledgement of this history, however painful it may be. While progress has been made through apologies, the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and ongoing efforts to implement the calls to action, the path to true reconciliation is long and demands continued commitment and actions from all Canadians. The ongoing legacy of intergenerational trauma and the recent discoveries of unmarked graves underscores the urgent need for meaningful reconciliation that addresses the systemic inequalities and injustices that persist today. Only through truth, remembrance, and sustained action can Canada hope to move forward on a path of healing and create a future where the rights and well-being of Indigenous peoples are fully respected and realized. Taking a look at a bit of the timeline, we can go back to the early 1800s with the establishment of the early mission schools for Indigenous children. We can look at 1831 with the opening of the Mohawk Institute in Brantford, Ontario. 1876, the passing of the Indian Act. In 1880s, the formal establishment of the federally funded Indian residential school system. In 1894, there was the attendance at residential schools that was made compulsory. In 1920, they amended the Indian Act, making attendance compulsory for treaty status children up to the age 15 and later increased that age to 16. In 1931, peak number of residential schools were in operation in Canada and the count was at 80. In the mid-1970s, most residential schools ceased to operate. In 1996, they marked the closure of the last Indian residential school, which was in Saskatchewan. And in 2006, the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement was reached. In 2008, a formal apology to the by the Canadian government, establishment of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was also in that year. In 2015, the release of the Truth and Reconciliation Final Report and 94 calls to action. In 2019, the residential school system designated a national historic event. 2021 and forward from there, discoveries of unmarked graves at former residential school sites have happened. At this point, they are still in the process of investigating and dealing with those locations, those school sites and the unmarked graves. And September the 30th has been marked as National Day for Truth and Reconciliation across Canada. Now, as we look at some of the findings of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission specifically, of course, the residential school system was a key element in a broader policy of aggressive assimilation aimed at the cultural genocide of Indigenous peoples. The system was a systemic government-sponsored attempt to destroy Aboriginal cultures and languages and to assimilate Aboriginal peoples so that they no longer existed as distinct. The intent and the resulting actions of the residential school system constitute cultural genocide. And again, these are the findings, some of the findings of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. They also found that thousands of students died while attending residential schools due to neglect, disease, abuse, and attempts to escape. That should not be overlooked or brushed aside in any way, given the abuses and the horrific events that happened within the walls of some of those schools, and the tyranny and just horrible conditions in which they were subjected to. Survivors of residential schools suffered widespread physical, sexual, emotional, and psychological abuse at the hands of school staff and others, while other people that were aware of these abuses turned a blind eye and allowed it to continue through silence. The legacy of the residential schools continues to have a profound and negative impact on Indigenous communities across Canada, manifesting as intergenerational trauma, social and economic disparities, and cultural disruption. So again, something that will take generations to really fully find any type of reconciliation and healing. But again, it is a horrific time that was marked by all of these inquiries and other investigations that have taken place in Canada over the years. And if you happen to be near any of these locations across Canada, I encourage you to stop and maybe lay some flowers down at these sites. With that said, I will recommend one thing, and that is not to have the flowers or things wrapped in plastic or other things, other types of materials that could just blow away, cause contamination of the area, just adding garbage to the region. So I suggest always taking the flowers out of the paper or the plastic, as they may have been wrapped by the florist or wherever you get them from, and take that waste away with you, leaving just the flowers there on the earth so they can be absorbed into the earth and brought full circle. So again, this has been James Cousineau with a special report here, The Shadow of Assimilation, and that was Canada's Indian residential schools at ProPix TV here in Metro Vancouver, British Columbia. Thank you for tuning in.